Hello, welcome to tonight's event with Bookmarks Bookshop, also been hosted by Extinction Rebellion Newham. Tonight we're joined by Steve Melia, who's an author of the new book, this one here, Roads, Runways and Resistance, from the Newbury Bypass to Extinction Rebellion. Steve's the senior lecturer in transport planning at the University of the West of England, and the book's a really good read and very topical with the environmental movement that's been going on at the moment. So without further ado, Steve, would you like to tell us about your book?
Thanks very much. Right, now, everyone see that? Is that okay? Can you see that, Josh?
Yeah, it's looking good.
Yeah, okay, good. Right. Good to talk to you all. Thanks very much to Bookmarks for hosting this. Writing books of this nature is always kind of a bit of a labour of love, really. I mean, I'm lucky in working 3.5 days a week, and as you can imagine, this took up an awful lot of the time that was left over over sort of nearly 3 years. And between the end of 2017 and early 2020, I interviewed 52 people in the different categories you can see there. You know, 6 former ministers, the advisors of different kinds, and there's some interesting characters there, and I'll come on to some of them in a bit. And of course, particularly campaigners and protest leaders, because this is a lot of what the book was about. So essentially what it aims to do is to tell sort of 2 interlinking sets of stories. So it picks 7 of the most controversial issues in transport and that affected transport from sort of the early 1990s to the present day. So they were the anti-roads protests of the 1990s, the fuel tax protest of 2000, various campaigns against road pricing and congestion charging in the early 2000s. The big ask. Now, that's an interesting one, because as I'll explain later on, I believe that was certainly arguably the most successful environmental campaign of all time. And yet, very few people remember it today. I'll come back to why that might be. Stop HS2, which of course has very much returned to the headlines again recently. Campaigns against airport expansion, which really span the whole period and overlap with Extinction Rebellion and my involvement with it from 2018 onwards. Now, in between all that, I'm also telling the story from the other side, from the political side. So while all that was going on, you had, I mean, the whole thing kicks off in the sort of latter days of Margaret Thatcher's government in 1989, when they launched Roads for Prosperity, which was this massive increase in road building, which sparked the protest movement. Then there was a very interesting period which didn't last very long in the early years of the Labour government of 1997, when there was a serious attempt to try to change the direction of transport policy, you know, to make it more sustainable than it had been. Now, what was behind all of that and why ultimately, as I would argue, that attempt failed, the book explains with the inside story of the people who were involved. Then, in the early stages, there was very climate change, although we knew about it and we knew how serious it was from the late 1980s, it really made no impact on the political agenda until the mid 2000s. So gradually the story of how climate change came onto that agenda starts then, and with a particular focus on how it impacted transport and aviation in particular, because there's always been a strong conflict between climate change policy and aviation policy. When the coalition government came into power from 2010 onwards, there was a major shift backwards towards big road building, and the man you can see there in the hard hat features quite prominently. He was.
I'm not sure if your audio's coming through there, Steve. I'm not.
Could you? Climate change policy.
I'm not hearing you.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear them fine, Josh. I can hear it fine.
Sorry.
Can you? Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So the man in the hard hat, George Osborne, was really responsible for the major shift backwards in transport policy, and the story of how and why he did that is fascinating as told from the inside. And then towards the end, obviously, there was at the time that Extinction Rebellion broke into the public consciousness, climate change very rapidly shifted back up the political agenda, and that is ultimately where the story finishes. Now, one of the funny things about writing this book is that, I have known some of these people for quite a while. I had some minor involvement in one or two of the events earlier on, but people like Jason Torrance, I got to know many years later when he was a sort of a respectable person working for, I think, Greenpeace first and then Sustrans, a sort of a man who would turn up to official events wearing a suit. And the story of the road building program and the anti-roads protest actually started with one event on Twyford Down in 1992, and it is captured in film. And what you can see there with Jason with a D-lock around his neck was the first moment when the direct action for the whole of that campaign kicked off. And this is how Jason described to me what it was like. It was cold in the mud. I was there for 3 or 4 hours. The police were there, and later cameras came. I could hear lots of commotion. Everyone else was removed from the machinery and I was isolated. When they turned the machinery on, I was terrified at first, but fairly quickly became at peace with the whole thing. And I realized at that moment, extraordinarily thinking about it now, it was something I was prepared to die for. And the driver of that truck actually started it up and started to move. And it was only because the crowd of his supporters sort of pushed forward and got the police to act that he wasn't sort of dragged by the neck all the way off the site. Now, this man, you may have seen, has come back into the news very recently. He actually, I hadn't checked today, but last I checked, he was still down that tunnel in Euston against HS2. Until I went to see him, I actually went round and stayed with him and his family. I think that was the first time he had actually given an interview since the 1990s, when he really had a very, very hard time at the hands of the media. and spent really most of his life trying to avoid them ever since. And it was really only at about that time that after I conducted that interview that I think was starting to become more comfortable with the idea of taking part in things which would lead him back into the spotlight. The other thing that was fascinating about that interview was that all his kids were there, and they were enthralled by what they were hearing. And at the end of it, his oldest son said to Dan, "Dad, can you show us how to build a tree house?" And I was amazed and delighted to see that his son, who is now 16, was with him down that tunnel in Euston recently. Now, another thing which happens, you'll see quite a bit of in this story, is lobbying. And I interview a couple of people from various lobbying groups, and the unpublished archives of the British Road Federation have been an absolute treasure trove of insights into what was going on during that time of the 1990s. And one of the really interesting things I discovered through this process, and this happens twice, different times in the story about different issues, is that the lobbying is very important and it's very influential, but it doesn't happen in the way you might think. We're all kind of familiar with the idea of, commercial lobbyists with loads of money, schmoozing politicians and persuading politicians to get them to do what they want. But what I discovered over the road building program and the question of climate change in aviation was it actually happened the other way round, that ministers went to the lobbyists and said, "Look, this is what we want to do. We know that's what you want as well, but we've got all these other problems. We've got these problems with the Treasury. We've got these problems with these, dratted environmentalists. So can you help us? Can you go and, say this, and this to the media? Can you lobby MPs and so on?" And there's actually documentary record of that in both cases. Now, some of the people in the book you will see are named. Most of the politicians, all of the campaigners and the people, not all the campaigners. There are one or two people in Extinction Rebellion who wanted to remain anonymous. But I took a decision to ensure that all of the civil servants and all of the advisors were anonymised, to protect the identities of those who really needed to be protected. Because when you read what they've got to say, you can realise why they might not want their names to be publicly connected to it. So let me just read out one example from this. Was a Treasury civil servant talking about what happened at the end of the anti-roads protest in the late 1990s. He says, "My day job was totally about cutting the roads programme and the local transport programme. My predecessor had reduced it in half. I effectively reduced it to nothing, apart from previous commitments. I reduced their forward programme to the Spalding bypass and re-signing of the M60 Manchester Ring Road. At no point did my seniors in the Treasury object. At no point was there more than the most superficial consideration of the effect on the economy or society." Now, that brief period during the Labour government of 1997 onwards, I tried very hard to get some of the ministers to talk to me, including John Prescott. I sent him a copy of my previous book, and told him what an important figure he was in this story, and I'd really appreciate to hear from him. And he sent me like a 2-line letter back that said, "Thank you very much for your book. I look forward to reading it. Yours sincerely, John Prescott." So drawing a blank with all of the politicians, I turned to the advisors, and actually I think I got more out of them than I would have done. I think that they were more honest and more incisive than politicians would have been able to have been. And I was very fortunate. One of these advisors, who is actually named, was a former colleague of mine, Professor Phil Goodwin, who had a key role in actually writing the Transport White Paper of 1998 under John Prescott, this was the one which really made that big change towards more sustainable transport, and specifically away from road building. Now, particularly during those Labour years, but also in some of the Conservative years as well, I've interviewed quite a number of these characters, the SPADS, Special Political Advisors. I was going to say the best known SPAD in the country in recent years, of course, has been Dominic Cummings. And these people really do, I mean, very, very interesting people. They wield an awful lot of influence. I mean, in some cases, you know, they were put in the position of telling ministers what they could and couldn't do. Now, all of them were sort of anonymized. Let me give you a taste of what some of them were telling me. This one was an advisor to Tony Blair, talking about that attempt to change transport policy. And he said, quote, "The 1998 White Paper was the culmination of thinking on more sustainable transport, but who was buying into it? John Prescott bought into it, but in the arts of government, John Prescott was not a first ranker. Phil Goodwin, Stephen Joseph and the others bought into it, but the chattering classes weren't buying into it. The senior politicians who mattered weren't buying into it. The CBI wasn't bought into it, so it was insecure." And that was really revealing and kind of explains quite a lot about what happened in the subsequent years. Now, most of the campaigns, well, 5 of the 7, you could characterize as being pro-environmental, but there were 2 exceptions, 2 which you could describe as backlash campaigns. And I think these were at least as important in the story. So you had the fuel tax protests. For those of you who were around that long ago, you won't forget it. I mean, this had a similar impact to COVID on national economic activity, except that it was really just a handful of hauliers and farmers who closed down some fuel depots and very rapidly closed down activity across the whole country. I was very fortunate, by the way, to find some people who were involved in these campaigns who really told me absolutely directly how it was and what happened. And then there were sort of various campaigns against road pricing. And I interviewed a couple of people who had been connected with the Association of British Drivers. Interestingly, when I was later on arrested with actions of Extinction Rebellion, and my name popped up all over the media, the only example I've ever had of somebody contacting me saying, right, that's it, I'm withdrawing my permission for you to use any of my interview material, it was somebody connected with one of those campaigns against road pricing. So I had to find other sources to tell that story. Now, the story of kind of HACAN and Plain Stupid is one of several which in the book, which introduce a kind of a mystery, an element of mystery to it. I said in the preface to the book is that I didn't expect to end up writing a crime or a spy novel, but different points in this story, this is exactly what it became. And some of this stuff is like stranger than fiction. You just couldn't make it up. And I actually had, quite coincidentally, I had some personal involvement in the aftermath of this really high profile campaign where protesters from Plain Stupid got onto the roof of the House of Commons and sort of hijacked the government's media handling of their consultation into the expansion of Heathrow. And this is what Leo Murray, who is one of the main movers behind Plain Stupid, this is what he described to me happened, and how I asked him, how did you get past all of that security in the House of Commons to get on the roof? And he said, a member of Plain Stupid had a friend, Laura. Now, that's not her real name, and I had to go to some great lengths to conceal her identity. Laura, who had recently left a job at the Houses of Parliament, but had not yet handed back her parliamentary pass. Laura took a cycle pannier in with our banner and handcuffs, which we obviously couldn't have got through security. We then entered through the public entrance with an identical cycle pannier. We all went and had a cup of tea in the Commons Cafe. Laura was on the next table from us. When we got up and we did the secret agent bag swap, we left with her pannier and she left with ours. We then got up onto the roof. We had someone down in Parliament Square who we notified as soon as we got up there. He went over to security and said, "Excuse me, there are some peaceful protesters on the roof. Don't shoot them, will you?" The officer looked round and the guy was gone. And then, totally by coincidence, some months later, I was in a meeting with in Portcullis House, opposite the Houses of Parliament, with Laura, who in her day job represented, had quite a senior position representing an NGO. And I was going to say, what happens next? Well, you can find out if you read the book. Now, there are several spies of all kinds appear in this book at several points. And I mean, some of these stories you might have read in the media in other contexts, but I discovered while I was doing this that people I knew had been spied on, sometimes by government spies, sometimes by police, sometimes by private enterprise spies. And Plain Stupid was one example, and this is what Leo Murray said about the there was a spy infiltrated them, and they rumbled him. He said he was always on time for meetings, which is very unusual in the world of activists, and he would arrive wearing things like a Ben Sherman shirt and a kaffir. You could smell a rat. Who employed him? What was he doing? Again, all of that is explained in the book. Now, this is another really fascinating story, how the Conservative Party changed its mind on Heathrow, because if you remember this far back, it was the victory of the coalition in the 2010 election which stopped the plans for the third runway. The Labour government at the time had approved it. Both coalition partners said, we will stop it. It was in their manifesto, it was in the coalition agreement. And so for those 5 years, they were committed. They could not do it. And the Lib Dems certainly would never have agreed to any change in that policy. George Osborne, very early on, decided he wanted to change that policy and commit the Conservative Party to expansion. The only problem was there were some other people who were standing in his way, including Justine Greening, the Transport Secretary. So this is what an anonymous advisor told me about that. They remember at least one difficult meeting between Greening and Osborne. And then over the summer of 2012, speculation began to appear in the media that Greening's days were numbered. The advisor says, clearly at one stage, Osborne was briefing against Justine. It didn't last long, but there was some hostile media comment about Justine, and I'm pretty sure it came from Osborne or his advisors. He was certainly asserting his authority over the Transport Secretary. Norman Baker, you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, he was a really great sort of interviewee. He gave me, really tell you very directly what was going on. And his comment on the reshuffle, the cabinet reshuffle, which got rid of Greening, amongst others, he said, it was not based on merit. Who got sacked? Effective Conservative ministers like Tim Long and Charles Hendry. And who got promoted? Idiots who were going to do what Osborne wanted. Now, moving forward to 2018, this was the situation which was increasingly frustrating me back then. The Climate Change Act seemed to have been working to some extent to start off with. UK emissions were coming down, but there was one sector which was really causing the whole national effort to grind towards a halt, and that was transport. And you can see there what was happening to the emissions in domestic transport, mainly surface, and international aviation, which was just rising and rising. And so by 2018, transport is far and away the biggest contributor to climate emissions in the UK, nearly, about a third of all of them. And so it was my kind of frustration with the sort of the disconnect between what we were hearing from the scientists about how serious the situation was with climate change and the pathetic inaction which I was seeing all around me and in all of my work, because most of my work is about trying to get a move towards more sustainable transport. And for all these tiny little improvements that we were doing, all the big stuff was moving in the wrong direction. And so it was that persuaded me when Extinction Rebellion started to join, and to make that commitment that I was willing to be arrested, which happened during the Spring Rebellion in 2019 and in London. And I found myself suddenly thrust into the limelight. There was a Daily Mail article which had a number of errors in it. You won't be surprised to hear. Described me as a government advisor, which is okay. Yeah, I have given some advice to government departments, but that was a little bit exaggerated. Government advisor arrested, and which then put me on the receiving end of all the the trolls on the internet and so on. And got me a fine of 500 quid, which I later discovered was far harsher than I think anyone else was given for, effectively what I'd done was, sat down in the road and refused to move twice. Whereas, in some cases, people who had glued themselves to trains or whatever were given a conditional discharge. I think the magistrate in my case clearly wanted to make some sort of example. Now, this then got me very involved in the campaign against airport expansion, which is still going on in Bristol. And you can see the action that we took there in Baker Street, targeting the headquarters of the Ontario Teachers Pension Fund, who are the largest shareholder in that airport. Now, all of that kind of has created some tensions for me, as I'm sure it will for, you know, for anyone who sticks their head above the parapet, because on the one hand, you know, I talking to, or had been doing, you know, research work for government departments, giving advice to them, giving advice to local authorities, doing all the usual kind of academic research stuff. Then when I was arrested and appeared in the media, that freaked the senior management of my university out. And, you know, I got the usual sort of, we're not going to give you this in writing, but we're quietly threatening you, sort of stuff, you know, and particularly saying that I was forbidden to talk to students about what I was doing. I mean, eventually, I think a lot of staff members joined Extinction Rebellion, and as the political tide started to turn, they backed off. And when I was got in the media after my conviction, they were more sympathetic. But the Department for Transport told me third hand, unspecific, probably deniable, you know, typical Whitehall fashion, told me that I had been blacklisted from government research projects. I don't know whether that's all of them, whether it's forever. I don't know who made that decision. Fortunately, I'm close enough to retiring that I can say, oh, well. You can imagine for younger academics, or, you know, younger people in any walk of life where their employers are going to make these sort of threats, that's difficult. And the other thing that I've sort of discovered in, well, I guess I already knew. I mean, I had a background as I'd done quite a lot of freelance writing for magazines and that in the past. So I was used to writing for a wider audience. But if any of you have ever had the pleasure of either reading stuff written in kind of academic journals, or even writing any of that sort of stuff yourself, you'll know how excruciating most of it is. And so you've almost got to kind of wipe your brain clean before you start writing for normal people. And I hope that I succeeded in doing that, because a number of people have said that they've enjoyed, you know, just the storytelling in this book. So you can form your own judgment about that. And while we're on this subject, you might also be interested in looking at this article, which I wrote a couple of weeks ago and was published in Left Foot Forward, which is about the threats to free speech in universities. You might have heard that this lovely character who you can see there, Gavin Williamson, is now posing as the defender of free speech in universities, which you will forgive me for being rather skeptical about. I actually happen to know something about this, because one of the characters who was involved I knew of old. And now the law of libel prevented me from writing everything I know. But if you read that article, what's in there is bad enough. Okay, so that's the end of my talk. Let me stop sharing the screen, and we can take questions.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you there, Steve. That was really interesting talk. We've had a couple of questions. I think I'll ask you, if it works for you, I'll ask you 2 questions and then let you come in, and then I'll ask another 2 if that's all right with yourself. Yeah. So the first question we've got is from Eden, and Eden says, what's the most significant political barrier to a more sustainable transport policy? And then we've got another question from Sam. This one's a little bit longer. It says, new transport infrastructure like HS2 and the Silvertown Tunnel only benefit business. and that we need a transport system that benefits ordinary people. He says that this is a symptom of a for-profit system, that green public transport would be a start, but do you think there should be a shift from climate activists to focus also on inequality and, the catastrophic handling of COVID as well? I think this is quite interesting with the scale of the climate strikes and, the other demands that they were putting forward around, such as like climate justice as well. So yeah, if you'd like to come back on them, and then we'll try squeeze in a few more.
Right. Okay. There's some really, really big questions here, aren't they? I mean, we could talk for a long time, and they're questions obviously to which there's no easy or kind of right answer. The barriers to, or the biggest barrier to sustainable transport. There's many of them. There is the commitment of those in power. I think the personal behaviour and the personal sort of contacts and of those who wield power, what they consider to be normal, I think is really important. I've spent quite some time in the past in the Netherlands, and trying to find out from if any of you have ever been there and with a bike and actually cycled around the country, you'll realize what a fantastic experience it is. And you ask their transport planners, how did you manage to do all that? And typically the answers are, well, look, all of our politicians, they cycle in to the council chamber. I cycle as a transport planner, all my staff do, so we're starting from that point of view of knowledge. Whereas, if your starting point is, those people who are making the decisions are themselves deeply wedded to the sort of car culture, then it's not surprising that they make the decisions that they do. There are many other reasons, but if you ask me for one off the top of my head, that's one I would give. Now, the transport system, and the broader issues. Now, the book addresses this question, and I have to say, I take a different view from what is now becoming the conventional wisdom, because when I have looked at the history, the sort of the research which is done into social movements, I think one of the things I've discovered about social movements is that there is a large element of self-deception is an essential element for their success. Right, people involved in social movements have to convince themselves that they have far greater powers than they in reality they do. All of the social movements that I review in the book, all of them had some impact, but very rarely in the way in which the people involved imagined. So, for example, no protest movement ever managed to stop a road once building was begun. The people who are down that tunnel, Euston at the moment, really passionately believe that they will stop HS2. They won't, not the first phase. That won't happen. It will be completed. But they have to, to motivate themselves and others and so on, they have to convince themselves of that. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's important part of the process. The problem comes when people outside then start to take some of that stuff literally. And so one of the ways in which a social movement can take the fast track to failure is to start expanding their remit. And there have been several examples of this. One of them that I gave in the book was Reclaim the Streets, where they started to believe that they've been so successful in these big actions that we can do also we can abolish capitalism. And so they turned into an anti-capitalist movement, which of course eventually fizzled out. And when you actually look at, what exactly did the anti-capitalist movement actually achieve over those years, you'd be hard pressed to actually identify any achievements. Whereas social movements can achieve real concrete things on specifics, as long as they remain targeted on those specifics. Now, the issue of climate justice is a complicated one for Extinction Rebellion. I talk about that in the book, and I've said it to some extent. My view has changed, particularly talking to some of the black and ethnic minority members of Extinction Rebellion who feel very, very strongly that we should be campaigning on climate justice. And I think they're right. But what we mustn't do is then to say, okay, and while we're at it, let's campaign to abolish racial equality. And how about the structural issue of capitalism? Maybe we should be campaigning against capitalism as well. Not that I don't agree that capitalism is a pretty evil economic system, and that we also need to campaign against racial injustice and so on. I think it needs to be a different group that does those sorts of things.
Thanks, Steve. Quite in-depth answers there. So I'm gonna bring in a couple more questions, but we've had a comment from Kathy, who's just hi Kathy. I was in the same XR group as Kathy a while ago, who just gave an update about Swampy, that he did leave the tunnel at some point yesterday, and from the photos that I've seen, he was greeted by a small welcoming party of activists as well. So if he's watching, hello. I doubt he is.
Right.
So we've got a couple more questions. So James has asked, what tactics would you recommend at this stage to stop HS2? So get prepared.
It will be possible to stop the first phase. I mean, that's not to say that, I wouldn't in any way criticize what I think that action in Euston, I think, is fantastic, and I think they really deserve all our support for doing that. They won't stop the first phase from going ahead, but there are all kinds of other issues at play. This isn't going to be the end of this. Interestingly, if you look at the carbon budget for carbon implications for the different phases of HS2, they turn significantly more negative if you look at the later phases. And while those guys were down the tunnel, the National Infrastructure Commission, a government body, has published a report saying, look, we actually don't think we're going to be able to afford all this stuff, and we actually think that instead of paying for the second phases of HS2, you'd be much better off improving kind of local and regional links in the North and Midlands. So that battle can still be won. So, and I think that the direct action which people, I hope, will continue to take against the construction won't stop the construction itself, but it's really, really important for winning those other battles later on.
Thanks, Steve. We have got a couple more questions. I think we've probably got time for these few. We've got another question from Eden, which is asking about the public and media sort of engagement with the campaigns, saying that could you compare the sort of response from the media and the public from sort of the 90s to now? I think that's quite good, obviously, just to understand how the movement's actually seen by the wider population. And I'll just ask the ones that we've got left, and then I'll let you come in. Kathy's asked about electric vehicles and sort of what you think about them because of the large carbon footprint and the exploitation of both people and the resources that we use to get them. I'll let you come back in on them, and then I think we've got two more, if that's all right.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Media coverage. Really good question. I've done some analysis of this. I did alongside the book. I actually published a couple of academic papers, which kind of took a more sort of analytical approach and really drilled down into data and so on. And the book kind of mentions some of what was in those and some of their conclusions without any of the sort of the numbers or the, you know, the kind of stuff that you probably find quite boring. So, but interestingly, I actually did some analysis on media coverage and public opinion over the late 1990s to the sort of early 2000s. And there is very strong evidence of how the protest movement shifted public opinion and also shifted the way in which road building was dealt with in the media. You know, the media started to air the environmental arguments against road building more and more. So it is possible, even with a kind of corrupt capitalist media, it is possible to change the way they report things. And one of the reasons why road building came back on the agenda is that once the protest movement had finished, was that the media story started to gradually revert back to form and to start, you know, saying, you know, talking more about congestion and saying how we need to build motorways and, you know, that sort of stuff. I think we saw the same thing with coverage of climate change. You know, the actions by Extinction Rebellion radically changed the way that the media reports issues around climate change. You know, and likewise, also there was a very measurable shift in public opinion. So all of those things are good, and they are working. You have to keep pressure up if you want to, you know, retain those gains. Now the second one, electric vehicles. I've written various things about this in the past, and you know, I've had a number of debates with people in Extinction Rebellion. I mean, I'm no fan of electric vehicles per se. I mean, my personal situation, right, is that 16 years ago now, when I first realized how serious the climate change threat was doing, I took a decision to stop flying. So I've flown once for essential work since 2005. So 8 years ago, and apart from that, I have never flown since then. I stopped driving 10 years ago and had not driven at all for 10 years until, actually, strangely enough, during the pandemic, where we were all being told to keep off public transport. I hope that will be temporary. So my personal kind of preference and all of my work has all been about, you know, shifting away from flying and car-based travel. However, what we have to understand is that in order to avert climate catastrophe, it's not enough to reduce, right? We cannot, so, you know, shifting people, for, you know, shifting journeys away from car onto public transport or bicycles or whatever, reducing the amount of driving, relocalizing things so that people can do more, working from home, by the way, vastly exaggerated as an influence, not as important in this as it's made out to be. But the point about all of these things is, on their own, they are not enough, right? We have to get to zero, right? What we have to do is we have to get to a situation where from the net zero date, whenever it is, all of the vehicles that are moving have to be, cannot use fossil fuels. So they have to be running on energy which is zero emissions. They also have to be constructed and disposed without using fossil fuels. So there's a separate exercise has to go on to 100% decarbonize manufacture as well, right? So therefore, all of the issues that we've had so far, all this talk about embedded carbon and so on, that will become irrelevant from that point if we succeed. And if we fail, then frankly, we're stuffed anyway. So we have to do both of those things. So I actually think, much as I don't like this solution, I think that electric cars have to be part of the solution. And at the same time, all of those environmental issues around their manufacture and disposal also have to be addressed at the same time. Now, in the kind of very long term, we have a much bigger issue about, finite resource use and, disposal of finite resources and so on, which has also got to be addressed. But the climate issue is so urgent, right, that if we don't crack this one, we can't be around to solve the other problems. And so that's why I think we must focus on the decarbonisation as fast as possible. And like it or not, that is going to have to involve some element of electrification, I think.
Thanks, Steve. We got a comment from Kathy just saying that it was like very spot on what you said about Extinction Rebellion and about the movement as a whole, and specifically that XR should be focusing on their three demands, and specifically the climate and ecological emergency bill. I think obviously if we don't say that to obviously go out and support it, everyone in XR who's watching would be very frustrated. So if you've not already, write to your MPs. Yeah. Just a final thing, I'll just quickly check the comments just to make sure this is the final thing. And it is as far as I can see. And it's just a question from myself, actually, because one of the big campaigns that sort of inspired myself to get involved in environmentalism was the campaign against climate change. And they had a big campaign, and they put out a booklet around climate jobs, a pamphlet, and like sort of setting out a program, which is actually, I think, supposed to be coming out again this year. And just with there was obviously there was a survey done with the oil rig workers in the North Sea, where the majority said that they'd prefer to actually work in green jobs, but obviously they can't at the moment because they're oil rig workers. And again, obviously Rolls-Royce recently have had strike action to sort of like green their workplace and fight for jobs. And I just think this isn't something that's massively mentioned in the book, sort of the workplace resistance side of things. And I think, with the discussion around capitalism that's come out, I just wondered, maybe it's like there's not been that much sort of workplace resistance around climate issues until more recently. But it'd just be interesting to sort of know what your thoughts are on that side of things, and if activists should be, not just taken to the streets, but fighting in their workplaces as well.
I definitely, and obviously some of this, as I said, it has been going on inside universities. There is a price to be paid for this. You do end up putting your job on the line if you step out of line. I mean, you can talk nicely in consultative committees and have sustainability committees and so on. Those sorts of things, I'm afraid, I don't have a very high opinion of. They don't actually lead to a great deal. But if you're going to really challenge the stuff that is central, so in universities, I particularly want to challenge academic flying, and have done. This fly. I have never flown to a conference, and I've turned down I don't know how many requests for that reason. There's a consequence for that. I've never been promoted in all the time that I've been here. That's possibly a connection. Doesn't matter very much to me. That might matter more to others. I mean, another industry that XR is very much targeting, and I've been minor role in recently, is the finance industry, which of course is knee deep in financing fossil fuels and all kinds of sort of environmental damage. Now, there are some insiders inside that industry who are willing who are not happy with this, and are willing to put pressure. And I noticed recently that XR has set up a kind of a service for whistleblowers. We want to hear from people inside those industries. Tell us what's going on. Blow the whistle on the greenwash and so on in particular. I mean, the examples that you gave there about shop floor workers taking strike action or whatever in support of greener job. I mean, that's fantastic if people are willing to do that. Again, likewise, there is a cost to all of that. I think that message that there are actually more and better jobs to be had from moving away from the way that we're doing things, I think that's a very powerful one. And the more people we can get on board with that message, the better.
Brilliant. Yeah, I completely agree on that. I think as well, like you say, with the flying, the pandemic's massively shown that flying to conferences and all this sort of thing, it's completely unnecessary. Everything can be online at the moment, and I mean, I imagine a 1 hour Zoom conference is a lot less ecologically damaging than getting a plane to any other country. I've not seen any more questions come in, so I'd just like to remind everyone that you can buy Steve's book at bookmarksbookshop.co.uk, or you can even email info@bookmarksbookshop.co.uk with your details and that you'd like to buy the book. I'd like to remind everyone, obviously, there is a big array of environmental groups, from Extinction Rebellion, Campaign Against Climate Change, the Fridays for Future, sort of student protests and stuff like that. And I massively encourage anyone to get involved in that. And as far as I can tell, we've not had any more questions. So I'd like to just thank everyone for joining today. And Steve, I'll invite you to make any last words if there's anything that you'd like to say finally.
There are many things I could say. I just simply wanted to say thank you to everybody. I hope you'll buy the book from Bookmarks, and who knows, when all this is over, I hope that one day I might bump into some of you.
Yeah, hopefully see you on a protest in the future, Steve.
Yes.
Brilliant. Thanks everyone for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.